Thank you for joining me for this session today. I'm going to speak mainly about organizational network analysis, as this is my area of expertise, I suppose, or one area of expertise. Yeah, let's get cracking. So Satalia, some of you might know Satalia already. We're a full stack AI firm, and we're specializing in machine learning and optimization. Our services are AI products, bespoke AI solutions, and we also give a lot of keynotes and education around AI. We have some major clients such as PwC and BBC and Tesco's, and our main solutions are around workforce optimization. So we work a lot in the sort of future of workspace. That's also kind of where most of my work sits. And especially our Lithuanian team, we have people working on delivery solutions, so kind of vehicle routing and infrastructure planning. Altogether, we have just over 100 people working at Satalia. We're kind of spread all over Europe mainly, but mainly in London and in Kaunas in Lithuania. A little bit about myself. I joined Satalia about half a year ago. Before that, I worked for 5 years as a freelancer, mainly working on sort of organizational psychology projects as well as network analysis projects. My background is in academia, so I've done my PhD at UCL in organizational network and organizational psychology, focusing on organizational network analysis. Until last year, I've been teaching psychology and research methods and network analysis at UCL. I'm currently sort of still doing a lot of research in academia, but mainly focusing on sort of more industry projects. I also, in my spare time, box a lot. So I'm an amateur boxer, and I just won the national championships before lockdown. So yeah, a little bit about myself. Cool. Okay. So organizational network analysis. So whenever I started studying as a psychologist, I got a little bit annoyed by the fact that the way psychologists treat problems, so what psychologists do in general is they try to understand and predict how people feel, think, and behave. And how they do that is mainly on going on individual traits, such as, for example, there's a big field which is around personality. For example, how does your personality, which you kind of have, or that's the theory from birth, and it doesn't really change much, how does that affect how you make decisions, how you might feel, or how you behave towards other people? So what psychology traditionally used to do, and this is the field of what's called individual differences, is focus on and explain that behavior and those feelings based on those individual traits. Yet, what I started to realize, and what's not really something new, but for a lot of psychologists, it still is something which they sort of struggle with, is that from my point of view, and what I've tried to do and prove doing research during my PhD, that the social context within which an individual is embedded actually matters a lot when it comes to how people behave, how people feel, and how people interact. As a matter of fact, I actually modeled these kind of outcomes of interest and showed that most of the time the social context is a much stronger predictor of these things than those individual traits. So, for example, who is buying the new iPad? An individual psychologist, or a lot of times like people who work in with people analytics, would look at things such as their personality, or their individual motivation, or any kind of factor which sits within the individual. As a matter of fact, what is the most predictive of you buying the new iPad is, do your friends have the new iPad? Do your friends want to buy the new iPad? Again, the same thing, who's depressed? One of the best predictors of who's, if you end up being depressed, is if you have family members or if you have friends who also have the tendency to be depressed. The same thing with happiness or with attitudes towards things. If you are vegetarian, one of the best predictors is if you grew up in a household, for example, who values not eating animals in that case, who you vote for. Again, if you look at statistics, it's mainly around, that you are influenced by the people who are around you, and that will determine what you vote for. Long story short, this also applies to organizational settings. So for example, who's professionally disengaged? You will see that disengagement is contagious, so it kind of occurs in clusters. It's the same thing, who's going to be leaving the company, who's the most likely to be leaving the company. If your best work colleague is leaving the company, you are very likely to also leave the company. So those behaviors and those feelings are contagious and are a function of how you are embedded in the social network. So there's a lot of studies, I'm not going to go very much in depth there, but which kind of show that phenomena. So you could see, for example, technology buying behavior up here. You can see those blue dots. They all bought the same piece of technology, so they influence each other in their buying behavior. You find the same things with emotions, such as happiness. Then there's quite a few papers around obesity and fitness. So that is a function of the kind of people who are around you. So how much you value fitness, how much you see yourself as being potentially obese is a function of what kind of people you have around yourself. And this one I particularly like is divorce can be easy. So basically, if your friends or if close contact gets a divorce, you feel it's kind of easier for you as well to get a divorce. So it becomes a more normal thing to do, I suppose, in a way. So long story short, what that means is that it's not all about individual traits. And I like this cheesy example of graphite and diamonds, because it's basically the elements are, the carbon atoms are the same, but it's all about how those things connect. If you end up having a brilliant, transparent and hard and rare, oh, my internet is breaking up, it tells me that. Okay. Can somebody say if they can hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. I just got a warning that my internet is breaking up. So okay, great. So what does that mean in a sort of organizational setting? In most organizations, you will find a formal structure, which is kind of like the organizational chart or the hierarchy. And it's based on seniority, it's based on job titles, and it's relatively static. For those of you who work in organizations which are structured like that, you will know that these kind of charts don't really mean very much in terms of the work really gets done and what's value creating. So every organization also has what we call an informal structure. And that structure is like a network. It's dynamic, it's based on collaboration. You have informal roles, so you have people who are opinion leaders, you have people who are bridging teams, you have people who are knowledge hubs, you have a lot of informal interactions, these interactions in the kitchen you have. And a lot of times these things are really, really important when it comes to decision making, but obviously those are not captured in the informal structure. And a lot of times the informal structure also looks a lot different to the formal structure when it comes to different kinds of power, for example. So if you look at this particular example, you can see that the guy Mitchell in the formal structure is somewhere down here. It looks quite insignificant, but if you look at the informal structure, how information flows through the organization, if you would take out Mitchell, then that would be a disaster, because it would break up information flow significantly. And then if you look at where the CEO sits, the CEO in the informal structure looks kind of slightly sort of off the chart almost. So you get the idea. What network analysis basically does is we look at these informal structures by kind of, and I like this metaphor of an X-ray of an organization. And I will give some examples. I'll dive into these in the following. But how can this method or this way of viewing people and understanding behavior be useful in the business context? So these are all areas where I've applied network analysis in the past. We can, when it comes to questions, I'm very happy to dive more deeply into any of these if you're interested in in any of these in particular, but I'll give some examples now anyway. Cool. So this is actually Satalia. One of the most popular things people know when it comes to network analysis is using it to identify informal key players. So as you remember in this map I've showed before, the informal key players, the informal opinion leaders might not necessarily be the ones which are formally acknowledged in the organizational chart. So basically what you can do is you can use network analysis to identify those key players. In this case, you can see the two blue dots are key players in this network. This network was the question why we assessed this network was who identify the amount of people who's able to distribute a particular piece of information, which was a change management initiative. So we identified this guy over here and this guy over here, and by using those two people, we were able to reach the rest of the network. This is not Satalia, but this is another company with 120 people. Here you can see we've only identified 3 key players, and through these 3 key players, we were able to reach all the blue dots in here, which was at this point the 75% of the book. And then with 5 key players, by identifying the 5 key players, we were able to reach 88% of the network. So why is this useful? Again, when you have a change management initiative to identify these change agents. In terms of mergers and acquisitions, I've done 2 projects in that area. When you're trying to merge 2 companies, what you're trying to do is really align those informal opinion leaders and those informal leaders. And by aligning and by connecting those people, the rest of the organization usually follows, because those informal leaders are the people who are trusted. Those informal leaders are the people who are important for collaboration, and those are ultimately the people who create value. Another area where you can use these key players is, and that's something specifically I've been focusing on in the last 2 years, is trying to really understand and characterize these key players. By understanding who are those, what characterizes those people who are value creating in your organization and who are trusted by other people and who are approached for advice and who are as such those key players and those opinion leaders. That kind of information can be super useful when it comes, for example, to recruitment. So you know what kind of people you need to be looking at, and you might need to want to recruit more, because a lot of times those key players are actually quite overburdened because they're so popular. So you want to make sure that you sort of replicate those kind of people, or like get other people on there with a similar skill set. But another thing which I always find really interesting is basically by identifying these informal key players and characterizing them, you will learn a lot about an organizational culture. So it's the people who informally drive and are able to motivate and energize and bring value in an organization will also be the people who kind of live a particular organizational culture. So, for example, characterizing key players, and I've done this at the Bank of England, looks very different than characterizing key players in the NHS, for example. So this is an example of one of the big 4 companies. They had 2 departments, and one of the departments was quite engaged. They were scoring quite high in creativity. They were scoring quite high in engagement, quite low in turnover. And you'll be unsurprised that department was the one on the right side, which is a lot more integrated. You can see how people kind of communicate across teams. And obviously that makes sense why those teams probably are better in terms of innovation. On the left side, you can see the other department, and you can immediately see how those teams in this department are quite siloed. So in this particular example, you can use network analysis to then go on and strategically foster inter-team collaboration. So rather than just telling people on the left side, oh, connect more with each other, you can look at which people do we need to connect in this network in order to maximally increase the density of the network. So in order to maximally increase how information flows through that particular department. So again, it just gives you, first of all, a diagnostic. It's a diagnostic tool, so you can see basically how people interact. You can see how information flows. You can see if you have weak points with regards to connectivity, and you can see if there's any bottlenecks or potential barriers using this methodology. I'm going to skip this slide just to save some time, but basically there's all sorts of ways we can visualize this. I'll just very quickly talk on the right side. We looked at how the different levels, so these were hierarchical level, interact with each other. It turned out that most of the burden is on level 3, and that explained basically why in this particular company, the senior managers were feeling overburdened, and a lot of them actually didn't feel like they were acknowledged in the kind of work they're doing, because they did a lot of informal advice giving, a lot of informal information sharing. They helped a lot, and these things were informal, so those are activities which are often silent and as such are not acknowledged. This was a project with the NHS. They had a leadership development program. One of the problems with leadership development programs is that sometimes it's really, really hard to kind of track the impact of the program. So here we had, this was in February 2018, and you can see how people were interacting. And you can see it's the network density is 15%. So there wasn't very much interaction in the beginning. And obviously the goal of the leadership development program was to get people to share more information, to get people to share the experience and to just interact more, because that was previously identified as a problem. In December 2018, we did the same analysis, and as you can see, the network density is now significantly increased to 64% in that case. So again, you can use this methodology to track these kind of changes. So in this case, a lot of times organizations want to know who are the sort of important informal knowledge hubs, which we call knowledge centers. Basically people who have the expertise which allow other people to get their job done in a sense. So this particular project, first of all, had the goal of identifying those knowledge centers and identifying those knowledge hubs, which you can see are those dots that are in blue. And you can see that some of those knowledge hubs are highly used. So a lot of people approach, and you can look, probably quite small, but you can see that a lot of people approach this person for this is advice giving. So, but there's also knowledge centers which are not used at all. So, for example, this person down here is widely acknowledged as a knowledge center and a knowledge hub, but nobody, for some reason, approaches this particular person. So that was interesting in the first place. What we did then is we looked at which are the people who are going to be leaving the organization, and we know that these people are going to be leaving the organization because they might be retiring, or because they might have, they might look for. We know that that person is currently looking for another job. So we colored those people in yellow. So what you can then do is look at, okay, what happens if we take those people out? So you can kind of simulate a future scenario and basically plan based on that, based on these insights in advance, how you can stabilize the network for the time when those people actually leave. This is a very similar kind of project we've done, and you can see basically we again looked at silos. The color of the node of the dot basically indicates what department or what team, in that case, the individual is part of. And then you can see the size of the node is their informal influence. So that, again, doesn't necessarily overlap with their formal position. And then we also looked at which are the people, those knowledge hubs. So we asked a very similar question, which we then colored in yellow. So you can see that, first of all, that those teams are relatively siloed in this organization. There's some weird stuff going on with one of the teams kind of being split up here. You can see that the knowledge hubs are quite overused in some cases, right here. They also bridge between teams, so they have a lot of information flowing through them. They're very, very powerful and very important. So the organization really needs to take care of them, make sure that they're not overburdened, that they don't experience collaborative overload, which quite a few of these people actually did in this particular company. And also we found that some of those knowledge hubs were sort of clustering down here, and obviously their knowledge wasn't really tapped into very much by the rest of the organization. So there's a lot of insights you can get from these maps, especially when you combine them with sort of more traditional metrics, such as their feelings on how for example, overburdened or overloaded they might be. To finish off with, this is I think the topic I'm the most passionate about, and I also think I've done the most projects with, diversity and inclusion. One of the problems with diversity and inclusion measures in organizations is that it is mainly based on quotes. So you would say, okay, great, we have 6 males and we have 6 females, we're doing fantastic. That, however, is diversity. You can see that as a legitimate measure of diversity. However, that has nothing to do with inclusion. You can have, for example, 6 females and 6 males. If the team, however, interacts in this way, like on the left side, that all the females interact with each other and all the males interact with each other, but there's no interaction between those groups, then that is basically no inclusion at all. So basically, even if you have diversity, if it's not leveraged, there's no point to it. It actually makes it worse. So how you can use network analysis to basically look at how inclusive are we in our organization. And the particular questions you can ask are, for example, is information flow affected by 2 people being a different gender or a different race, or whatever diversity metric you're interested to look at. So it could be gender, it could be race, it could be your background, it could be even things like tenure time, because a lot of times, that might also make a difference. So basically, it allows you to really look at these biases which people might have, and it's quite a common bias in psychology, which is called homophily. So we are attracted to people who are similar to ourselves, and so females might prefer going to other females, and ethnic minorities might prefer to go to other people who are ethnic minorities, and the other way around as well. So you can pick up those biases using network analysis as well. I'm going to stop here. Yeah, I think, yeah, perfect. So and open up, I think, for 5 minutes of questions.
Yeah, Laura, thank you so much for your session. And we have a question from Laura as well. Her name is Laura. How data is gathered about informal connections, knowledge hubs, and so on in organizations?
Yeah. Oh my God, this was so weird. I'm so sorry. Like it's really strange to give a presentation only seeing your own screen, because you feel like you're talking to your screen. Because I obviously didn't see any people. Yeah, good question. I mean, so there's various different ways. In general, there is active data. and active data is data you directly collect using surveys. I use a 2-minute pulse check where I directly ask people about who they approach for advice to, for example, get their daily job done, or who is important in terms of giving them information to successfully complete their job. But I also might ask questions around who supports them, personally supports them, because that's important as well. So you can basically, asking these questions, you can create these networks, and you might have professional networks which are based on questions such as, who's important for professional advice, but you also have affective networks, they're more emotional networks, kind of where the links between people are personal support connections, or even friendship connections. So you can have all sorts of different networks based on collecting this active data by asking questions. So that's one way, and that's just based on a 2-minute survey, 2 to 3 minute survey. The other way of collecting data is using passive data. So data which is already in the organization, which might be based on calendar data, for example. You can see, at least at Satalia, we all of our meetings are in the calendar, so we can see who's attending particular meetings, and then we can create networks based on that kind of information. You can use email data. For example, we're just turning our CRM into a network project, so we can see basically how with who we connect externally, and then who might have connections which are relevant internally. So you can use passive or active data depending on the question. So depending on the business question, as well as depending on the availability of data. We also use Slack, for example. We use Slack for Satalia, but that might not be relevant for other organizations. Like, most of our communication in Satalia is on Slack, so that works really well for us. But a lot of companies don't use Slack very frequently, so the representation you get just for Slack data might not be valid.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see Koskon is raising his hand.
Yeah, hello.
Hey.
Laura, thank you very much for the informative and inspiring talk. I would like to ask a question about your slide showing the network diagram between colleagues, knowledge centers, and the retirement age colleagues. Mm-hmm. In such a network case, or in such a work environment, how would Satalia or artificial intelligence would help us to reorganize our communications?
Yeah.
How can we change the situation, that negative impact of retiring colleagues?
Yeah. So you can plan, and this is the thing, you can plan for it. So by simulating, and you don't really need artificial intelligence for that. It depends also on how you define artificial intelligence, which brings us into a completely different topic. But what you can basically do is you simulate what would happen to the network if that will happen at some point, if that particular person leaves, right? So you take these people out of the network, and you can see, you can immediately see what kind of holds there are created. And you can then look at, and you can use algorithms to determine which people do we now need to connect in order to kind of fix the network's density. So we can recreate those bridges which basically have been destroyed by this particular person leaving. So that would at least at this point help us restore the information flow again. The other thing is, by understanding the characteristics and the knowledge of this particular knowledge hub, you can, and this is about this characterization of key players, you can understand, okay, well, we know that Paul has this particular, I'm just making up Paul here, Paul has this particular knowledge, which is really important for the organization, but Paul will leave. So we can start looking for somebody who also has knowledge, which Paul had, because you characterized them in advance. So one thing is about restoring the network. So you have the density, you have you have good information flow, you have you don't have silent teams. And the other thing is around characterizing key players. So who are the people who are actually value creating in the organization, and who are important with regards to collaboration, and ensuring that when these people leave, that you strategically restore the network by fostering particular connections.
Thank you for your answer. Yep. And by the way, it's really important to understand two aspects of the networking: the connections between people and also the density of the communication. I especially like that aspect of your speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.